The I in Solid stands for Interface Segregation Principle, which says that clients should not be forced to implement an interface or depend on methods that it doesn't use. Let's have a look at a simple example. What we have here is an interface called property contract, which requires that all classes that implement this interface have two methods, address and bedrooms. The two classes that implement this interface are apartment and garage. For the apartment class, both of the methods are suitable, as apartment usually has the address and the number of bedrooms. However, for the garage class, bedrooms method is completely redundant because it is a different type of the property. But because it implements the main interface, it is forced to provide the implementation of this method. Let's have a look at a more in-depth example in the editor. So what we have here is this property contract. If we have a look at this, we have the address, we have floor area, floors, bedrooms, bathrooms, living rooms, and studies. And every class that will implement this interface will have to provide implementations of these methods. Then we have an abstract property class, which takes an array as a constructor argument, then initializes it with the internal attributes property, and we have a getter method here to get the given property, obviously the value from this attributes array by its name, and then obviously the magic get method as well to basically make a call to the internal get method. And if we scroll down, we have implementation for the two methods required by the property contract, which is the address and floor area. As you can see, if we scroll up to the top, we have address and floor area. These two methods are the methods that are common across the apartment, garage, and house. So all of these classes will need the implementation of both of these methods. That's why we put them straight away in the abstract class. And then if we have a look at the apartment, it extends the property and it implements our property contract. So it needs the implementation of the floors, even though it's not going to have floors. Apartments usually are just one floor. So here we just return 0 for this as a value from this method. Then for the bedrooms, we obtain the value from our attributes property. Then same for the bathrooms, living rooms. And for the studies, again, apartments usually don't have studies, so we just return 0 here. If we open garage, as you can see, all of these methods are returning 0 because they are actually redundant for the garage. We only need these two, which are within the property class, which is the address and the floor area. So as you can see, these methods could be completely removed from here, but obviously because we are implementing this property contract, we need to provide implementations for these methods as well. Then we have a house, which has implementations for all of these methods because obviously house has floors and it also might have studies. Okay, so how can we improve all this? But before we actually do anything, let's have a look at the test, because I've written tests as well here. As you can see, we have garage has a set of required methods, and we checking for the address and floor area because these are the required methods. These are the methods that we would expect the garage to have. Then we have the same for the apartment, only the methods that we would expect it to have. And then we have the test for the house as well, which will technically have all of the methods that are actually declared within the interface. Okay, let's run this test quickly. So if we open the terminal, PHP unit, as you can see, all of them are passing. So that's great. So let's now go back to the editor and have a think about how we can actually refactor this code so that it complies with the interface segregation principle. I'm going to close this test here. The first thing I'm going to do, if we open this property contract, obviously all these methods are within one interface. Perhaps we could split them into separate interfaces and only use the interface that we actually require on a given class. So that's what we're going to do. First of all, what we're going to do under the source directory, I'm going to create a new directory, call it contracts. And what I'm going to do is move this property contract to this directory. And I'm going to update the namespace here. So rather than property, now it's contracts. And the first thing I'm going to do is to make sure that we only have address and floor area here. As you may remember, within the property class, we have implementation of the address and floor area, which are the methods that are shared with all of the classes. So it makes perfect sense here that this property contract will only contain these two, because every property needs these two methods. Then floors method could perhaps go into a new contract. Let's quickly create it. We are going to call it multi-story contract. And it's going to be an interface, so I'm just going to quickly select it here. If you don't use PHP Storm, make sure that obviously declare a new interface, multi-story contract. And then here we are going to move this method, public function floors. So let's move it to this interface, and we can now save and close this multi-story one. Next one, let's do the residential contract perhaps. So PHP class residential contract, and it's also an interface. And here what I'm going to have, if we just go back to our property contract, we will have bedrooms, because a residential property will have bedrooms, it will have bathrooms, and it will have living rooms. So these three methods can go to this residential contract interface. If we save it and close it, and then the last one I'm going to have is going to be called, if we just create a new PHP class, it's going to be called large residential contract, meaning houses, large houses, and that sort of things. So if we now create it, I've forgotten to declare that it's an interface, so let's just quickly rename the class with the interface, and this one will have this status method. Now, another thing that I'm going to do here, because interfaces in PHP can extend other interfaces, large residential contract will also apply to the residential properties, so we can simply extend the residential contract, meaning that whichever class will implement this large residential contract will have to implement the status, but also all of the methods that are declared within this residential contract. So if we now save and close it, now let's remove this redundant space. So now our property contract only has these two methods. And because our property class has implementations for both of these methods, why don't we just make sure that this abstract class property implements this property contract, because we know that every class that will actually extend this property will already have implementation of both of these methods. So we can now save our property class because we're not going to be making any more changes to this one. Save and close it. Same for this property contract. Now with the garage, now we can obviously remove this implements property contract because our property abstract class already implements this contract. And for the garage, because all of these methods were redundant here, we can remove them all and just leave this class as it is, because garage only requires the address and floor area methods to be available, and we already have them available from within this property class, so we don't need to add any more implementations here. So we can save and close garage class. Let's open apartment one. Now for the apartment, we can again remove this implements property contract and replace it with residential contract. So now our apartment will we won't need floors, we will also not need studies, but we will need all of these methods: is bedroom, bathrooms, and living rooms. And what we can do, because as you may remember, obviously house will also need these methods. So what we are going to do is to create a set of trades. Under the source directory, let's create a new one called trades. And here we are going to start with the first trade, which is going to be called residential. And it's under the namespace app and then trades, because I have app namespace associated with the source directory and then obviously trades for this directory here. Now it is a trade rather than just a class. And here we are going to basically cut all these methods that we have, these bedrooms, bathrooms, and living rooms. If we cut them from this apartment class, paste them within the residential, and now what we can do here is just use this trade. So use a residential, and there we go. And our apartment class is now also completed. But rather than having these implementations directly within a class, by moving them into this trade, that means that later on we can use this trade in any other class that might require these three methods. So we can now save both of the files, and then the last file that we have here is this house, which will extend the multi-story contract, and it will also, implement, and then also implement large residential contract. As you may remember, large residential extends the residential contract, so we will need these bedrooms, bathrooms, and living rooms. But because we already have this trait, we can remove these three methods. So let's just use this trait here. So use residential, and there we go. Now, as you can see, this highlight is gone because we're now complying with the requirements from within this class. I'm just going to rearrange this slightly because obviously this residential provides these three methods for the residential contract. And then floors, which is part of the multi-story contract. Why don't we create another trait here and call it multi-story? Multi-story. And it's going to be a trait as well. And let's move this floors method to this multi-story trait. There we go. And we can now use it with our house class. So let's just use multi-story. There we go. And obviously, again, the highlight is gone because we are now complying with the requirements of this contract. Now, we also have this studies methods here, which we should also extract to a trait. So let's just create a new trait. This time we're going to call it large residential, and I think that's it. So let's just make sure that it's a trait. There we go. And we are going to move this studies to this large residential, but the same way that we did with our contract large residential. You may remember we extended residential contract. Why don't we just use residential here from within this large residential? This way we provide all these methods that are also within this residential trait to whichever class actually makes use of this trait. So rather than just using residential here, why don't we just use large residential, which we know contains all of the methods that are within the residential trait as well. So this way, as you can see, we cut down on so many duplications of the methods. We now store them all within the traits, and we can just use them whenever we need them for the given property type. Same obviously with these interfaces. So we can now save the house, save this large residential trait, and our code is pretty much refactored. The only last thing that we need to do now is to run a test again and make sure that everything still works. And it does. As you can see, we've now refactored our classes. If we open one by one, you can see apartment doesn't have any methods within the class itself because it uses a trait which has all of the implementations. It implements only the interface that is actually applicable to this property type. Then the garage doesn't implement any methods because the only two methods that it requires are automatically available to the garage by extending this abstract property class, which implements the property contract and has implementations of the address and the floor area. Now for the house, we've done the same thing. It extends properties. Obviously, it also has access to this address and floor area, but we also implement multi-story, which means the multi-story will give us access to this floors method, and then large residential, which will give us access to the studies, as well as all of the methods within the residential contract, which are bedrooms, bathrooms, and living rooms. And then we obviously use these two traits, which give us the implementations of the methods for both of these contracts. So we've managed to successfully refactor our code to comply with the interface segregation principle, where none of the classes implements the methods that it doesn't need.